On the morning of June 5th, 1999, in a hotel in the Italian Alps, 3 doctors took blood from the most famous cyclist on the planet, Marco Pantani. He was leading the Giro d'Italia by 5 minutes and 38 seconds. He'd won 4 stages. He was, according to everybody watching, absolutely untouchable. 5 hours later, his career was over. 5 years later, he was dead in a hotel room, this time in Rimini. The official version is that he failed a drugs test, lost his way, and overdosed on cocaine on Valentine's Day 2004. The official version has been the official version for 22 years. But I have one question. Why does the Italian Parliament's Anti-Mafia Commission, 23 years after that morning in the Alps, say the blood test that ended Marco Pantani's career was conducted with, and this is a quote, numerous and grave violations of the rules? Why, in July 2024, was Italy's most notorious living gangster questioned about that morning by Italian anti-mafia prosecutor 25 years later in a prison outside Milan? And why is the case in 2026 still open? To understand why this matters, you need to understand who Marco Pantani was and why he is culturally so significant to cycling. He was born on the 13th of January 1970 in Siena and raised in the coastal town of Cientico, where his father was a plumber. The legend told and retold in the Italian press is that his father gave his son a countdown. You have 1 year to make it as a professional cyclist before you have to come home and join the family business. Marco didn't need a year. By 1992, he'd won the amateur Giro d'Italia. By 1994, in his second professional Grand Tour, he'd finished second behind Brezin and just ahead of Miguel Indurain, who at that point was probably the most dominant rider on earth. The Italian newspapers gave him a nickname before he'd really won anything, Il Pirata, the pirate. The bandana, do you remember how cool that was? The earrings, the shaved head. He looked like a villain from a comic book. He looked like nobody else in the peloton. And he climbed like nobody else in the peloton. Most riders climb sitting down. They still do. Think about riders today. They get up when they're accelerating. Pantani climbed out of the saddle, standing up, hands on the drops like a sprinter. This is the position you take when you want to just throw absolutely everything onto the road in front of you. And his record, the times he set up some of the most iconic climbs in the world, Alpe d'Huez, Mont Ventoux, Les Deux Alpes, they still stand today. In October 1995, on a descent at Milano Tirreno, the police failed to close a road properly and a car wandered onto the course. It was a shocking crash. Pantani hit a car head on. He fractured his tibia and his fibia on his left leg. The bones were held together with a metal splint. His left leg was permanently shorter than his right leg, and most people at the time thought he was actually finished. But he wasn't. He came back. In 1997, he won 2 Tour de France stages and he finished 3rd. In 1998, Giro d'Italia, beating Tonkov, and then 6 weeks later, did the thing that Italians born after 1998 still talk about as if they remember it. On the 27th of July, 1998, stage 15, Grenoble to Les Deux Alpes, Pantani was sitting 4th in the general classification. He was 3 minutes behind Big Jan Ullrich, the German who looked that summer like he was going to win the Tour de France for the 2nd year running. Remember that day, it's iconic, it's raining, it's 4 degrees Celsius at the top of the Galibier. Pantani attacked with 6 kilometres of the Galibier still to climb. He took the rest of the breakaway with him on the descent and he dropped them again on the final climb, and he crossed the finish line in Les Deux Alpes almost 9 minutes ahead of the German Jan Ullrich. He took the maillot jaune that day, the yellow jersey, on a single afternoon. L'Équipe the next morning ran a headline, Pantani au plus de clients, Pantani the highest of heavens, a French hymn. They were comparing him to the religious figure. He'd won the Tour de France. He became only the 7th man in history to win the Giro d'Italia and the Tour de France in the same year. That's who Marco Pantani was when he woke up in Madonna the Campiglio on the morning of June 5th, 1999. Madonna's a ski resort, and in June it's mostly empty. The 1999 Giro d'Italia was passing through it on the second to last weekend of the race, with 1 mountain stage and 1 flat stage before they were set to finish in Milan. Pantani had won the previous day's stage into Madonna by a clear margin. He was wearing the Maglia Rosa, the leader's pink jersey, and he was leading the race by 5 minutes and 38 seconds over Savladelli and 6 minutes over Gotti. The next stage was a mountainous stage to Abraca, finishing on a climb, and climbing was Pantani's specialisation. He was the best climber in the race that year. He was, by every reasonable measure, going to win his second Giro d'Italia in 2 years. At 7:46 on that morning, the 5th of June 1999, 3 doctors entered Pantani's hotel room at Hotel Touring. His teammate Marco Vello was sleeping in the same room. They were preparing for that day's stage. The doctors took blood. They took it from Pantani and they took it from the other top 10 riders in the race. This was the third UCI blood test of the Giro d'Italia. Pantani had passed the first 2. And here's the thing that a lot of us don't realise around this. The UCI didn't have a test for EPO back in 1999. EPO, for anyone that doesn't know, is the drug that boosts your red blood cell count, that makes you a faster climber, just makes you a better overall rider by feeding more oxygen into your muscles. There was an epidemic of it in cycling, and there was no test for it at the time. What there was instead was a workaround for the test. The UCI measured hematocrit, the percentage of your blood made up of red blood cells. If your hematocrit was over 50, they suspended you for 2 weeks. They call this a health test, but everybody knew what this test was really testing. The blood was drawn at Hotel Touring, and the samples were taken then, and this is the first detail you need to remember about this story. They were taken then a kilometre away to a different building, the Hotel Majestic. This is where the analysis was done. Marco Pantani's test came back at 52%. 2 points over the limit. He was told he had to leave the race. He went down to the hotel lobby at Touring, where there were cameras, there were policemen and the world's press waiting. And the only thing he said clearly to the journalists outside the hotel that morning was, "Mi hanno fregato. They screwed me." A few hours later, on his way back up the Adriatic coast, Pantani went to a hospital in Imola, a UCI accredited hospital, and he had his blood tested again. The reading came back 48.1%. He had it tested a second time, 47.6%. He also had it tested himself the night before in his hotel room with a small centrifuge that a lot of cycling teams in the peloton kept in their buses in that era, because the cyclists weren't idiots. They knew what 50% meant. The test the night before for his hematocrit was 48%. So here's the question that has hung over Italian cycling for 27 years. 48% the night before, 48% a few hours after, and in between, at 7:46 a.m. that morning, in a hotel room in the Alps, the precise moment that mattered, 52%. What happened in those few hours? For more than 2 decades, that question went unanswered in any official capacity. The original UCI test was upheld. Pantani was charged in Italy with sporting fraud. He was later acquitted, not because he was found innocent, but because doping wasn't yet a criminal offence under Italian law in 1999. Then, in late 2022, the Italian Parliament's Anti-Mafia Commission published the findings of a long inquiry. They'd reviewed the chain of custody for the blood sample that day. They'd reviewed the doctor's testimony. They'd reviewed every protocol that was supposed to have been followed that morning. Their conclusion was the test had been conducted with, and these are their words, numerous and grave violations of the rules. What kind of violations? The blood was drawn in Hotel Touring, was taken to Hotel Majestic for analysis. That is not in itself a violation, but it created a window of about an hour by some accounts in which the sample was not under continuous observed custody. Kind of a flaky chain of custody of events around here. And when you let a blood sample sit, the red blood cells settle to the bottom of the test tube. The platelets and white blood cells, they drift up. If you measure the red cell percentage in the lower part of the settled sample, you get a higher hematocrit reading than the actual blood would give. So here's the thing the Anti-Mafia Commission found. Pantani's test that morning showed unusually low platelet levels. His test at Imola hours later showed normal platelet levels. And according to the hematologist that the commission interviewed, this is what you would expect to see if the original sample had been drawn from the lower settled part of the tube, the part with red blood cells, but not the part with the platelets. Now, the commission did say that this alone does not prove manipulation. If you tune into the cycling media, you'll hear a lot about carbon bikes. But the truth is, not all carbon is created equal. And that's really what Parlee is about. Basically, instead of mass producing frames as quickly as possible, They're taking sheets of high-end carbon and laying them up by hand, piece by piece, with really precise control over how everything is orientated. It's a slower, more labour-intensive process, and that's exactly the point. Most brands don't do it this way because it takes way too much time, it takes too much skill, and it's just more expensive. But Parlee have always leaned into that. Parlee frames are made in small batches by experienced builders in the US and Portugal, with a big focus on how the bike actually feels to ride, not just how it looks on paper. Yes, these bikes do sit at more of a premium price point, but once you understand how much work goes into each frame, it starts to make a lot of sense. So when you ride a Parlee, you're not just getting a carbon bike, you're getting something that's been built by a level of precision and attention to detail that most brands don't aim for anymore. If you're curious, you can check them out at Parlee, PARLE.com, and see the full range there. I've been riding my Parlee bike for the last couple of months and I'm blown away by the ride and the experience and even people's reaction to it. It's a true work of art. Before we go any further, we have to be honest about one thing here, the elephant in the room. Marco Pantani was, to my mind, almost certainly using EPO. So was an entire generation of his rivals. When he was hospitalised after the 1995 Milano-Tirreno crash, his hematocrit was foretold to be, or speculated to be, 60.1%. Italian prosecutors who later went through the Ferrara Biomedical Institute of Professor Francesco Conconi, who was eventually described by an Italian judge as morally guilty of promoting doping, although acquitted in the criminal trial, they found a marked DB lab which appeared to track the hematocrit values of athletes through the early 90s, and Pantani's name was on this. Now, this is not a story about an innocent man. This is a story about a system that was running on EPO from the top to the bottom, that had no test for the drug that was actually trying to catch, that decided to measure something else instead, this health check, as a proxy. And then on a single morning, with a single rider, at a single moment, that happened to be worth several hundred million lira to a network of clandestine bookmakers, failed to follow its own rules. What happened after that morning is, in some ways, the most important part of this story, because it is the part that nobody disputes. Pantani was 29 years old. He was at the peak of his earning powers. He was a national hero. His sponsor paid him millions of lira a month. His mother, Toniana, says he was a different person from that day on when he came back. He raced again in July 2000. We all remember that day on Mont Ventoux. He attacked Lance Armstrong on the final climb. Armstrong was leading the tour at the stage. He sat on his wheel most of the way up Ventoux and he gifted Pantani the stage win. Pantani, through his career, had built this reputation of just being able to hurt himself and go deeper than anyone else. And he was furious after that Armstrong gifted him the win and deprived him of this opportunity and this honour to hurt himself and go deeper. A few stages later in that Tour de France, incidentally, Pantani actually abandoned the Tour de France with stomach cramps and he never won a Grand Tour stage again. Cocaine started by his own ex-girlfriend's account in the months after that Madonna. In 2003, he overdosed on cocaine 4 times. He crashed into 8 cars in 1 hour in November 2000, and a single police photograph with his Mercedes parked on the top of another vehicle made the Italian papers. He was admitted to psychiatric care in 2003. His final professional race was the 2003 Giro d'Italia. He finished, at somewhat muted 14th overall. In an interview not long before he died, Pantani said, "Today I don't associate cycling with winning. I associate it with terrible, terrible things that have happened to me and the people close to me." On the 14th of February 2004, in a residence called La Rosa in Rimini, about 30 kilometres down the coast from where he grew up, Marco Pantani was found dead. His hotel room number was D5. He checked in alone. The door was blocked from the inside with furniture. The windows were closed from the inside. The autopsy listed cerebral edema and heart failure. The cause of death was acute cocaine poisoning. He was 34 years old. If the story ended in that hotel room in Rimini, this would be a different podcast. It would be a story about a great athlete, best of a generation, and a great fall. Someone who flew too close to the sun, a tragic end. But the story doesn't end there, because in the years since 2004, Pantani's mother has refused with a stubbornness that has outlasted multiple prosecutors and 3 separate investigations into his death to accept what happened in La Rosa was a simple overdose. So here's what we know now about that night and about why the case is still open in 2026. An open file in the office of the Italian magistrates sits on the desk. In 2014, a family lawyer, Antonio De Rennes, presented Italian prosecutors with new material. The newspaper La Repubblica claimed that Pantani's body had shown signs consistent with a brawl. La Gazzetta dello Sport ran the headline, "Pantani was killed and forced to drink cocaine." The theory presented to the prosecutor in Rimini was that Pantani had let a man into his bedroom early that morning, and those men or man had attacked him, that they'd forced him to drink water dosed with a lethal amount of cocaine, and that the disordered state of the room was staged after he'd already died. In 2015, the Rimini head prosecutor, Gio Vagnoli, closed that investigation. He said the room had been blocked from the inside and that the windows were closed from the inside, and there was no evidence pointed to anyone other than Pantani himself. He concluded the death was more likely than not voluntary suicide caused by accidental excessive intake of cocaine. A judge in Rimini archived the case in 2016. However, in 2019, after submissions from the family lawyers and from the Italian Anti-Mafia Commission, the case reopened for a third time. And then in July 2024, something else happened. A different Italian prosecutor, Ferreira, working in Trento under the chief prosecutor Sandro Romandini, opened a new investigation, not into the death itself, into just specifically the test, that morning at Madonna, 25 years earlier. On the 12th of July 2024, the prosecutor went back to Bollete just outside Milan. She was there to question one of the most notorious figures in Italian criminal history, Rentino Valanesca, known to the Italian press as El Bel Reni, has spent more than 50 years in prison. He'd spoken about Pantani in the early 2000s, but his statements had never formed the spine of an active criminal investigation. The account recorded in the prosecution file is this. Long before June 1999, it was known among the prison population and inner circles that Pantani would be removed from the Giro before it reached Milan, because there was a network of clandestine betting riding on the result, and Pantani was the favourite, and the clans could not afford him to win. An unidentified witness whose identity's been withheld, quoted in the anti-mafia's commission papers, put a number on it. If Pantani had won that Giro d'Italia, the Camorra would have had to pay several billion lire to clandestine bookmakers and risked bankruptcy. There's also a witness in the death case itself, Fabio Miradosa, one of the men prosecuted for supplying cocaine to Marco Pantani. He testified before the Italian magistrates that in his view, Pantani had been murdered. He spoke about his interactions with Pantani and how Pantani was in search of the truth about what happened that day at Madonna. A taxi driver in Rimini, questioned during the third investigation, claimed he had driven 2 women to La Rosa on the night Pantani died and picked them up later wearing different clothes from the ones they arrived in. Now, I need to say, this is speculative, circumstantial evidence at best. None of this is proof. None of this is proof of anything. And the Italian investigators have been very clear about that. The 2024 file in Trento is what the Italians call a Modello 44 investigation. An investigation without a crime, an investigation without suspects. Excuse the brief interruption. The Roadman Cycling Podcast has teamed up with Bicmo Cycling Insurance for this episode. Because let's be real, stuff happens. Whether it's a crash, the heartbreak of a stolen bike, or the all too familiar disaster, reversing over your prized aero wheels. Bicmo can help you protect your ride. They've got flexible policies you can cancel anytime, a 50% discount on extra bikes in your household, and coverage that extends to your kit, your race entries, and even travel when you're chasing that epic weekend adventure. So whether you're smashing sprints, grinding climbs, or just enjoying a Sunday spin, ride safe. Bicmo's got your back. Protect your ride before it's too late. Head to bicmo.com and get covered. That's BIKMO.com. Flexible policies, cancel absolutely any time. Check the terms in your policy docs. Here's what I think this story actually is. is a story about a sport that ran on EPO for a decade and decided when the public pressure forced its hand to police itself with a workaround instead of a real test. It's a story of an athlete who was almost certainly part of that system and who almost certainly did not deserve to be the single rider made to carry the weight of an entire era on the wrong morning, in the wrong room, with the wrong test tube. Now, whether the Italian mafia, the Camorra, reached into that hotel room in the Alps that morning and tilted the result of the blood test, well, that's a question the two Italian prosecutors are still investigating. The answer may be that they did. Maybe they put their hands on the scale. Maybe they didn't, and that the procedural failures that day were just that, just procedural failures. And whether Marco Pantani on Valentine's Day 2004 died alone with the door blocked from the inside, or whether the man who'd been admitting strangers to hotel rooms for years had done so one last time, that is the question that Tonia Pantani's mother has refused to let go, and that Rimini's prosecutor's office refused 4 times now to call permanently close. The morning he walked out of hotel touring and said, "Mi hanno fregato, they screwed me," was the morning the most loved climber of the modern era of Italian cycling has produced began the descent that ended in a hotel room in Rimini 5 years later. Cycling's official record has spent 27 years agreeing on what happened that morning. The Italian Parliament's Anti-Mafia Commission in 2022 found that the rules that morning had been broken. If you're watching this and you grew up on the 1998 Tour, on Pantani in the rain on the Galibier, the rider protest, the bandana flapping on Les Deux Alpes, the man who attacked 50 kilometres out because he didn't know how to ride any other way, you've spent most of your adult life with one version of this story. He doped. He failed a test. He couldn't live with the consequences, and he died. The version the Italian state is now investigating, it's a different version of this story. It is the version where a man who was probably guilty of one thing was made to pay for a whole era, on a morning when the rules that should have protected him were not followed, and where the question of who benefited from that morning has, 25 years later, finally got the attention of the anti-mafia prosecutor. Both these things can be true at the same time. That is the part of cycling history that nobody wants to look at. Marco Pantani was born on the 13th of January 1970, and he died on the 14th of February 2004. The investigation into how and why is open as to the time we recorded this video.